Nestled between Turkey, Russia and Iran, the Caucasus is one of the most linguistically diverse regions in the world. Historically, these lands have accommodated countless kingdoms, religions, and dozens of ethnic groups and languages. Today, this relatively small region hosts 6 language families: Northwest Caucasian, Northeast Caucasian, Kartvelian, Indo-European, Turkic, and Mongolic. In this video, we're going to explore the Kartvelian language family. The Kartvelian language family includes 4 languages: Georgian, Mingrelian, Laz, and Svan. They are primarily spoken by the Kartvelian people, or in other words, Georgians and their subgroups, which are the Megrelian, Svan, and Laz people. These languages have no proven relation to any other language family, making them language isolates. Around 5 million people speak Kartvelian languages today. Georgian is by far the most widely spoken of the 4, while Mingrelian, Laz, and Svan are regional languages, preserving diversity within the small but mighty family. Throughout history, Kartvelian languages were spoken in lands that pretty much correspond to modern-day Georgia. As opposed to other language families of the Caucasus such as Turkic and Mongolic, the Kartvelian languages never really spread. Despite being surrounded by many strong peoples in history such as the Romans, Persians, Byzantines, Russians, Seljuks, and Ottomans, the Kartvelian people never lost their cultural identity and flourished in their ancestral lands. Georgia is shielded by mighty mountains and high hills in both the north and south, which have acted as natural borders for centuries, helping the Kartvelians to avoid external threats. Perhaps the most unique aspect of the Kartvelian languages is their unique writing script, also known as the Georgian script, which looks pretty cool and often gets confused with the Armenian script. But if you look carefully, they are completely different. The Georgian script has a unique and distinctive appearance, consisting of a rounded and elegant form. Actually, when we say Georgian script, we're talking about 3 scripts: Asomtavruli, Nuskuri, and Megrelian, and I apologize if I butcher the pronunciation. To summarize briefly, Asomtavruli is the oldest, used mainly in religious texts and inscriptions. It has a more angular design and is often seen in stone carvings and monuments. It was popular between the 5th and 9th centuries AD. Developed later in the 9th century AD, Nuskuri is a cursive script that combines elements of Asomtavruli with a more flowing style. It is mainly used in religious manuscripts and is characterized by its ornate letters. Megrelian is the most widely used script today. It emerged in the 11th century and is the standard script for modern Georgian writing. Megrelian is characterized by its simpler, more rounded letters and does not include uppercase and lowercase distinctions. Here we see all 3 scripts. As you might notice, Asomtavruli and Nuskuri share many similarities, whereas Megrelian has considerably different letters. The origin of the earliest Georgian script, Asomtavruli, has never been established, so we don't know for sure when, where, and by whom the Georgian script was created. If you meet Georgians and Armenians in the same setting, I suggest you avoid asking, "Do you guys know who created the Georgian script?" If you do, things might get heated quite fast. In short, there are 3 main ideas behind the origin of this script. The first one claims that it was created in the 3rd century BC during the pre-Christian Georgian era by the ancient Georgian ruler King Parnavas. The second idea claims that the creation of the Georgian script was contemporaneous with the Christianization of Georgia in the 4th century AD. According to this view, Georgian King Megrelian III ordered the creation of a new script to translate religious texts into Georgian after the adoption of Christianity. And the third view, which causes some controversy, supports the Armenian perspective. This view claims that Mesrop Mashtots, a prominent Armenian linguist, statesman, and historical figure known for creating the Armenian script, also created the Georgian script in the 5th century. I don't want to contribute to this heated debate at all, however, out of these claims, the second one is more widely accepted. Regardless of everything mentioned, the Georgian script is a unique cultural gem and serves as one of the main pillars of Georgian national identity and culture. Out of all 4 Kartvelian languages, Georgian is the only one with a well-developed and continuous literary history, which includes religious texts, poetry, and national epics. The prime reason for this is that Georgian has been and still is the language of liturgy, whereas Mingrelian, Svan, and Laz have been chiefly spoken languages, and they use Georgian for written communication. The Kartvelian languages are primarily agglutinative, meaning they form words by attaching various suffixes to root words. These suffixes often carry grammatical meanings such as tense, case, or mood. For example, meftsar translates to I am writing. If you break it down, me is I, V is the first person singular marker, and sat is writing. The Kartvelian languages typically have rich case systems. For example, Georgian has 7 grammatical cases, which mark the syntactic functions of nouns and pronouns. In all Kartvelian languages except Svan, the vowel inventory is fairly small, with just 5 basic vowels. But there are a lot of consonants, I mean a lot, and they make pronunciation quite challenging. Another characteristic feature of this family is that the Kartvelian languages do not mark grammatical gender. There are no distinctions between masculine and feminine and nouns, pronouns, or adjectives. Despite being a small language family, Kartvelian languages also have branches, and they look like this. We see Proto-Kartvelian as the starting point of this family. Later on, Svan was the first language to diverge and form its own branch. Therefore, it is the most divergent of the Kartvelian languages and is often seen as the most archaic. Then we have the Proto-Karto-Zan branch, which was divided into Georgian and Zan branches. Georgian formed its own branch, and later on the Zan branch was divided into Mingrelian and Laz languages. I feel like we had a long and informative intro. Now we can individually dive into these languages in more detail. Without any further ado, let's start with the most widely spoken Kartvelian language, Georgian. Georgian is the official language of Georgia and by far the most spoken Kartvelian language. According to the 2014 census, the population of Georgia is 3.7 million and the Georgian language is spoken by 3.4 million people in the country. To be more specific, 3.25 million of the Georgian speakers in Georgia are Georgian, Mingrelian, Svan and Laz people. The remaining 150,000 Georgian speakers consist mainly of Azerbaijanis, Armenians and Russians, who are also the largest non-Kartvelian minorities in the country. Some other countries with significant Georgian and Georgian-speaking populations include Russia, Iran, Turkey, Ukraine, Azerbaijan and Greece. In addition, smaller Georgian groups can be found in Germany, the US, France, Poland and the UK. The Georgian diaspora is quite widespread globally, but except for Azerbaijan, Turkey and Iran, they are not densely concentrated anywhere. At least that's what my research has shown me. As a result, outside Georgia, these 3 countries are the only ones where we can mark Georgian-speaking majority spots on the map. In Russia, the Georgian-speaking population is around 112,000, 81,000 of whom speak Georgian. They are mostly concentrated in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other large Russian cities. In Azerbaijan, the 2019 census shows that there are 8,400 Georgians living in the northwestern part of the country, almost all of whom speak Georgian. The next Georgian language hub is in a small area in Iran. I was actually quite surprised to see a Georgian community here, this far from the homeland. There is an estimated 100,000 ethnic Georgians living in Iran. These Georgians, known as Fereydani Georgians, primarily reside in the Fereydan region of Isfahan province as well as in other areas such as Tehran and Mazandaran. They are descendants of Georgians who were forcibly relocated to Iran during the 16th and 17th centuries by the Safavid dynasty. Despite living in Iran for centuries, many Fereydani Georgians have preserved aspects of their language, culture and traditions. Although there is no contemporary official data, it is assumed that a few thousand Fereydani Georgians still actively speak the Georgian language. It is quite fascinating to see such a Georgian community. Today, if you go to the Fereydan region, you can see how Georgian is still an important part of daily life. You can see the Georgian language being used in shopfronts, signboards, food packages, cars and such. This is truly beautiful. Moving back to our map, the next country with a significant Georgian population is Turkey. The information about the Georgian people and language in Turkey is a bit tricky due to the fact that many Georgians have assimilated into Turkish society over the past decades. Technically, the last Turkish population census that recorded the spread of languages in the country was conducted in 1965. According to this, 79,000 people spoke Georgian as a native or secondary language in Turkey. Also, in 5 cities, the most common language after Turkish was Georgian. However, this was a long time ago, and surely things have changed. Today, we can only estimate the state of the Georgian population and language in Turkey. Turkish Georgians primarily live in northeastern Turkey along the Georgian border. Presumably, there are around 100,000 Georgians in Turkey, though this number could also be greater than a million. Around 15 to 20,000 of them speak the Georgian language today. However, please take these numbers with a grain of salt. Alright, now we're going further west to Greece. Yes, Greece is also an important hub for the Georgian language. It is assumed that between 27 to 45,000 Georgians live in Greece today, mainly in big cities such as Athens and Thessaloniki. Since this community mainly consists of Georgians who recently moved to Greece for better paying jobs, it will be accurate to say that almost all Georgians speak their language. Ukraine also has a large Georgian community with a population of 20 to 30,000, a few thousand of whom spoke Georgian. However, this is a pre-war assumption. The current status of the Georgians and the Georgian language in Ukraine is unknown. Many people don't know this, but there is also a significant community of Georgian speakers in Israel, primarily consisting of Georgian Jews. Unfortunately, this is not a well-studied group, so we don't have accurate and contemporary information about their population. However, it is presumed that there are between 40 to 70,000 Georgian Jews in Israel, around 30,000 of whom speak the Judeo-Georgian dialect. At the beginning of this video, we talked about how old the Georgian language is. It is so old that the oldest Georgian inscriptions date back to the 5th century AD, and surprisingly they were discovered quite far from the Georgian heartland. The Bir al-Kut inscriptions are a set of ancient Christian mosaics and inscriptions found in 1952 at the site of Bir al-Kut, a location near Bethlehem in the West Bank. These inscriptions date back to the Byzantine period around the 5th and 6th centuries AD and are significant for their early Christian context and for being in the Georgian language, making them the earliest known examples of written Georgian. The Megrelian Georgian script used today has 5 vowels and 28 consonants. Being phonetic, Georgian is pronounced exactly as it's written. However, pronouncing some Georgian words can be quite hard, as there are many words that contain a lot of consonant clusters. Let's take the famous Eupilas as an example. The sentence Eupilas in English would translate to Gupvrtsni in Georgian, which I cannot pronounce, and it has 9 consonants followed by 1 vowel. However, I doubt you'd really use this word in daily life unless you are an apple or a potato. Numbers are also pretty interesting in Georgian. From 1 to 29, everything seems to be normal, but once we hit 30, things get a little messy, just like in real life. The number 30 in Georgian is otstati, which breaks down into otsi, meaning 20, and ati, meaning 10, so it's more like saying 20 plus 10 in English instead of 30. 40 is 2 times 20, 50 is 2 times 20 plus 10, 60 is 3 times 20, 70 is 3 times 20 plus 10, 80 is 4 times 20, and 90 is 4 times 20 plus 10, but 100 is normal, no tricks here. Speaking of tricks, father is mama and mother is deda in Georgian, which I thought was pretty interesting. Georgian has no genders, which as a Turkish speaker is a familiar concept to me. For he, she and it, only one word is used, is. The Georgian script does not distinguish between uppercase and lowercase letters. However, some Georgians like to write the first letter of the sentence slightly larger to give that uppercase effect. Also, there is no difference between handwritten and printed Georgian letters. Georgian has no articles. As a result, for example, cat, a cat, or the cat are all said in one way, which would be kata in Georgian. Speaking of cats, nouns in Georgian never go plural with numbers. For example, I have 1 cat is arti katamkavs, I have 2 cats is ati katamkavs, and I have 200 cats is orasi katamkavs. Do you notice how the word kata remains unchanged? But of course this does not mean that Georgian does not have plural noun forms. This is specifically for cases when the noun comes after a numerical value. Since we touched upon the word I have in the previous example, I would like to share another interesting characteristic of the Georgian language. There are 2 ways of saying to have in Georgian, one for non-living objects and one for living objects. For example, I have would translate to both makvs and makavs. If you want to say I have a pen, which is a non-living object, we would use makvs. However, to say I have a friend, we would use makavs. Interestingly, Georgian considers car a living object since it is capable of moving. Leaving aside all these linguistic features, many other things fascinate me about Georgian. First of all, compared to other Caucasian languages like Azerbaijani and Armenian, Georgian was spoken in a relatively small area that corresponds to today's borders of the modern Georgian state. So this language did not really spread to large areas but remained the indigenous language of the Georgian heartland, which leads us to our second point. Throughout history, Georgia was surrounded by strong powers like the Romans, Persians, Byzantines, Turks and Ottoman Turks, Russians, the Soviet Union, and such. However, the Georgians maintained their cultural identity and language in the same region for centuries, and they flourished. This is quite cool and admirable. And now let's take a look at the language profile of Georgian. It is written in the Megrelian script and spoken by around 3.7 million people in total. It belongs to the Kartvelian branch of the Kartvelian languages. The status of Georgian is safe, making it the only non-endangered Kartvelian language. And now let's hear how Georgian sounds.
შექმნა სამყარო ძალითა მისძლიერითა, ზეგარ მარსმისურითა, ნაზეცით მონაბერითა, ჩვენ კაცთა მოქცა ქვეყანა გვაქვს უთალავი ფერითა, მისგან არს ყოველი ხელმწიფე, სახითა მის მიერითა. ღმერთო ერთო შენ შექმნ, სახე ყოველი სატანისა, შენ და მიფარე ძლევამეც დათქმულად მესატანისა, მომეც მიჯნურთა სურვილი, სიკვდილი მდეგა სატანისა, ცოდვათა შემსუბუქება მუნ თანაცა სატანისა.
The Mingrelian language, also known as Megrelian, is the second most spoken Kartvelian language. It is spoken by the Mingrelian people in western Georgia, particularly in the Samagrelo-Zemo-Svaneti region. There is also a small group of Mingrelian speakers in the Abkhazia region. Since Mingrelian, Laz and Svan people are all considered to be subgroups of Georgians with their own distinct identity, they are registered as Georgians in population censuses. Therefore, we don't have an exact count for the Mingrelian population. The last time Mingrelians were counted was during the 1926 Soviet population census, when their number was recorded as 242,000. Today, the Mingrelian population is estimated to be between 300 to 500,000. Historically, the Mingrelians have lived largely in the same lands they inhabit today, so they never spread to large areas. Their language developed in the fertile lands between the northern and southern mountain ranges of western Georgia. Today, most Mingrelians are bilingual in both Mingrelian and Georgian. Georgian is the dominant language used in education, media, and government, while Mingrelian is mostly confined to informal home and local settings, making it an endangered language. Mingrelian is mutually unintelligible with Georgian despite their shared ancestry, though the two languages share many grammatical and lexical similarities. Mingrelian is somewhat close to the Laz language. Together they form the Zan branch of the Kartvelian language family. Mingrelian does not have a long tradition of being a literary language like Georgian, but efforts have been made in recent years to promote its written use. In the past, it was primarily transcribed using the Georgian script, but today it is more frequently written using the Georgian alphabet with some modifications to represent specific sounds in Mingrelian. The customized Georgian script for Mingrelian includes 35 letters. However, despite these efforts to promote its written form, Mingrelian remains primarily a spoken language and is rarely written. Despite its vulnerability, there have been efforts to preserve the language. Local activists and linguists have promoted the use of Mingrelian in literature, music, and radio broadcasts. There are also some attempts to create educational materials in Mingrelian, though these efforts are still in their early stages. In my research on contemporary printed media in the Mingrelian language, I came across the newspaper Gal. Gal is a trilingual newspaper published in Georgia's Abkhazia region in Russian, Abkhazian, and Mingrelian. It is the only newspaper today published in Mingrelian, or at least that's what my research has revealed. Here you can see a page from 1995, and this is a section in Mingrelian. Mingrelian is written in the Megrelian Georgian script and is spoken by an estimated 300,000 people. It belongs to the Zan branch of the Kartvelian languages, and its status is classified as definitely endangered. Laz, also known as Lazuri, is spoken by the Laz people. For centuries, the Laz have inhabited the eastern Black Sea coast of Turkey and Georgia. Today, the total Laz population is presumed to be between 100 to 250,000. Some sources suggest the number could be as high as 1 million, but there is no definitive data. More than 90% of the Laz population lives in Turkey, mainly in the eastern Black Sea cities of Artvin and Rize. 7 vicinities in these 2 cities have the highest concentration of Laz speakers in the world. According to UNESCO and Ethnologue, between 20 to 30,000 people in Turkey speak Laz. Outside of Turkey, Georgia has the next highest number of speakers with around 1,000 people. Additionally, small communities of Laz people have immigrated to countries like Germany and the US, but it is believed that only a handful of people in these communities are fluent in Laz. The most recent census data for Laz speakers in Turkey comes from the 1965 population census. As I mentioned previously, this was the last census in which Turkish citizens were asked about their native languages. According to the results, 26,007 people at that time spoke Laz as their native language, accounting for about 0.08% of Turkey's population. In earlier Turkish population censuses, the number of native Laz speakers were recorded as 63,253 in 1935, 46,987 in 1945, 30,566 in 1955, and finally 26,007 in 1965. Throughout history, Laz has primarily been a spoken language. As you can imagine, languages that lack a strong written tradition are more vulnerable to extinction. Laz has survived for centuries by being spoken in homes and villages, but today it is in a precarious state. In 1984, German scholar Wolfgang Fürstein and Turkish author and teacher Fahri Karaman developed a writing system for the Laz language based on the Latin script. This was an important milestone for preserving this endangered tongue. Before that, in the early 1900s, there was a short-lived attempt by linguist Iskender Çitashi to create a Laz alphabet and protect the language. He developed a written script for Laz using the Latin alphabet and published the first newspaper in Laz. However, he was executed in Tbilisi in 1938 by a firing squad by the Soviet regime. Although the number of Laz speakers is in decline, there are many efforts and initiatives by Laz speakers in Turkey to raise awareness about the language and protect it. For example, in 2015, the Agani Munutsi newspaper in the Laz language was published for a year. In the 2000s, a few magazines in Laz were printed, and in 2011, the first novel in Laz was published. There are also other initiatives to preserve the Laz language. For example, a Little Prince audiobook in Laz is available on YouTube, as well as Laz Turkish and Laz English online dictionaries, Spotify playlist of Laz songs created by Laz people, and the YouTube channel entirely in the Laz language. Laz is written in the Latin script in Turkey and the Georgian script in Georgia. In total, close to 30,000 people speak this language. Laz belongs to the Svan branch of the Kartvelian languages, and its status is classified as definitely endangered. Svan is spoken by the Svan people, who live in western Georgia's mountainous Svaneti region. There is also a small Svan community in Abkhazia. The Svans are not counted as a separate ethnic group in Georgian population censuses, but their population is estimated to be between 50 to 80,000, with between 25 to 30,000 Svans speaking their ancestral language. The Svans have a rich and ancient culture, a distinctive language, and a long history that predates many of the peoples of the Caucasus. The Svaneti region is characterized by rugged terrain, isolated villages, and stone towers that are iconic to Svan architecture. The Svans are predominantly Eastern Orthodox Christians in line with the rest of Georgia. However, their Christianity retains many pre-Christian elements with ancient pagan traditions still visible in their rituals and festivals. Historically, the Svan people were largely self-sufficient, relying on agriculture, livestock, and trade. The region's isolation made it difficult for outside influences to penetrate, allowing them to maintain a degree of autonomy with a unique social system and traditions. Svaneti often served as a refuge for Georgian kings and nobility during times of invasion due to its remote and easily defendable geography. The Svan language differs significantly from other Kartvelian languages. It split off from Proto-Kartvelian and formed its own branch relatively early, around the 2nd millennium BC. As a result, Svan is almost completely unintelligible with the other Kartvelian languages. Moreover, while Georgian, Laz, and Mingrelian have 5 vowels, Svan has between 7 to 18, depending on the dialect. Some of these additional vowels in Svan are preserved from Old Georgian, which was spoken between the 5th and 11th centuries AD. Svan is primarily a spoken language with no official writing system. There is an adapted script based on the Georgian script, but it's rarely used. Like the majority of Mingrelian speakers, Svan speakers are also fluent in Georgian. Svan is mostly spoken in homes and informal settings. It is orally passed on to younger generations. The Svan culture, language, and traditions face challenges in the modern world. The isolation that once preserved their way of life is breaking down, and younger generations often migrate to urban areas. Efforts are being made to preserve the Svan language and cultural heritage, but the language is in decline. In recent years, initiatives to revitalize Svan have emerged through cultural programs, language documentation, and local education efforts. However, these efforts face challenges due to the language's limited use in public life and the preference for Georgian. As mentioned, Svan has no official alphabet. It is spoken by between 25 to 30,000 people and belongs to the Svan branch of the Kartvelian languages. The status of Svan is classified as definitely endangered.
Ali skwebnav erva ali gwes archevde